The sun had no mercy that day. It hung above the New Mexico desert like a blazing coin hammered into the sky, burning everything beneath it. The air shimmered above the sand and rock. The mesquite trees stood brittle and gray. Even the vultures were too tired to circle. By mid-morning, the ground was so hot it could blister the hoof of a horse, and the only sound across the land was the soft, slow creak of the windmill outside a lonely ranch house at the edge of nowhere. That ranch belonged to Elias Turner, a man whose life had been carved by loss and silence. His face was burned brown from the sun, his hands hard from years of fence posts and cattle ropes, his voice quiet like the distant thunder of an empty plain. He had been a soldier once, years ago, before the war between settlers and the Apache had turned into something ugly and endless. When it ended, or when it seemed to, he came here to start again. He built his small ranch from nothing but stubbornness and sorrow. His only companions a few cattle, a mule, and the ghost of his wife, Maria, who died before she could ever call this land home. Every day, Elias woke before dawn. He'd tend to the cattle, fix the fences the wind had torn apart, and pray for rain that never came. But on that particular morning, the one that history would later call the day mercy changed a war, something felt wrong. The wind had stopped. The birds had gone quiet. The land held its breath. Elias noticed it when he walked out to the water trough. He felt the stillness pressing against him. It wasn't silence. It was waiting. He looked toward the horizon, east, where the land rose into red cliffs, and saw 3 figures moving through the haze. They were faint at first, like mirages, but as they drew closer, Elias knew exactly who they were. Apache. He froze. Every settler in those parts knew what that meant. For years, fear and vengeance had run like wildfire between the ranchers and the tribes. Livestock stolen, homesteads burned, families taken or worse. The army called them hostiles. The settlers called them devils. But Elias knew better. He had fought them. He had seen their eyes, proud, fierce, and desperate. They were men, not devils. Men fighting to hold on to what little they still had. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. Elias squinted through the heat. The 3 Apache riders were moving slowly, their horses stumbling. Their spears drooped. One of them leaned low over his horse's neck, barely holding on. They weren't raiders on the hunt. They were dying. He felt his stomach tighten. Out here, a man learned to read the signs of thirst and death. Their lips were cracked white. Their skin glistened with fever. He could almost hear their need for water, even from a distance. The only water for miles was at his ranch, in the old stone well behind the windmill. Elias stood still, the sweat drying on his back. He knew what the right thing to do was, and he knew what the smart thing to do was. The smart thing was to load his rifle, bar the door, and wait until they passed. Maybe they'd die out there in the desert. Maybe they'd crawl away into the canyon and vanish. Either way, he'd live to see another sunrise. Mercy was dangerous out here. Mercy could kill you faster than a bullet. But Maria's voice, the memory of her soft, stubborn heart, stirred in his head. Elias, she used to say, a man's worth ain't measured by what he fears. It's measured by what he offers when no one's watching. He cursed it under his breath. Damn it, Maria. He went inside, grabbed the Winchester from the rack, and stepped out to meet them. As they drew closer, he could see their faces. One was older, his braids streaked with gray. Another was a young man, maybe 20, his eyes sharp but clouded with exhaustion. The third, the one slumped over his horse, looked barely alive. His arm hung loose, blood crusted down his side. When they reached the edge of the corral, the old man raised his hand in peace. Elias did not lower his rifle. The old Apache spoke in a rasping voice, broken English mixed with his own tongue. We no fight. We need water. Elias's throat felt tight. He looked at the well, then back at them. He could almost feel the eyes of every rancher for miles staring over his shoulder, whispering, "Don't do it. They'll kill you. They'll burn your land." He lowered the gun anyway. "Water's there," he said quietly. "Help yourselves." The young Apache dismounted first, stumbling toward the trough. He cupped the muddy water in his hands and drank like a starving man. The older one helped the wounded rider down, his body limp, his breath shallow. Elias stepped forward without thinking. "Lay him here," he said, pointing to the shade near the porch. They obeyed. For the next hour, Elias fetched clean water from the well, tore strips of cloth from an old shirt, and tried to wash the blood from the young man's wound. The Apaches watched him warily but didn't interfere. The older man finally said, "He is my son." His voice trembled just enough to betray the weight he carried. "Army chase us 2 days. No food, no water." Elias didn't answer. He pressed his palm against the wound to stop the bleeding. The boy groaned but didn't wake. Sweat rolled down Elias's neck, dripping into the dust. When he looked up, he saw something unexpected in the old man's eyes. Not hatred, not pride, but gratitude. Pure, quiet gratitude. Hours passed. The sun fell lower, painting the desert in long red shadows. Elias shared what little food he had: stale biscuits, a bit of jerky, a canteen of weak coffee. The 3 men ate in silence. The only sound was the whisper of the windmill turning again, slow and tired. Then, as the light began to fade, the old Apache spoke. "White man help Apache." "Why?" Elias looked into the fire he'd built, the smoke curling between them. "Because dying of thirst ain't a way for any man to go. Doesn't matter whose land he's on." The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "You are different." Elias didn't know what to say to that. He didn't feel different. He just felt tired. Tired of the killing, the fear, the fences cutting the world into pieces. When night came, the desert turned cold. Stars spilled across the black sky, sharp and endless. Elias leaned against the porch post, rifle across his knees, while the Apaches slept near the fire. He couldn't rest. Every creak of the boards, every rustle of the grass made his hand twitch toward the trigger. Old habits die hard, but something in him, something deep, began to shift. In the morning, the wounded young man woke. His fever had broken. His father helped him stand. The younger warrior, the one with sharp eyes, approached Elias. He took something from around his neck, a small carved stone, smooth and dark. He held it out. "For you," he said simply. Elias hesitated. "What is it?" "Promise," the young Apache said. "You give water, we remember." Elias took the stone. It felt warm in his hand. He nodded. "Then remember." The 3 mounted their horses and rode east, vanishing into the light. The land swallowed them whole, leaving only dust in their wake. Elias stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon. He didn't know that less than a week later, soldiers from Fort Bliss would ride through his land chasing the same band. He didn't know that the old Apache he'd helped was a chief, and that his mercy that day would ripple across the borderlands, changing how one war ended and another began. All he knew was that he'd done what his heart told him to, and somehow, the land itself seemed to breathe again. That night, as he sat alone by the dying fire, Elias turned the carved stone in his fingers. The flames reflected off its surface, glinting like the eye of something ancient and wise. He thought of Maria's voice again, whispering through the years, "Kindness don't die, Elias, it just waits for its turn." And out in the desert darkness, far beyond where he could see, the Apaches were already telling a new story about a white man who offered water when the world had turned to dust. The story that would change everything. The dawn came pale and cold, like the desert was holding its breath again. Elias Turner was already awake, sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching the horizon. The air smelled of dust and rain that never came. The carved Apache stone lay on the railing beside him, glinting faintly in the early light. It had been 6 days since he'd offered water to the riders. 6 days since the 3 figures had vanished into the red hills. The world had returned to its quiet rhythm, but quiet in these parts never lasted long. The windmill creaked. A buzzard wheeled low over the canyon. Then Elias heard it, the faint thunder of hooves in the distance. He turned his head. At first, he thought it might be the Apaches returning, but as the sound grew, he saw dust rising, too much for just a few horses. And soon, from that cloud, came the shape of uniforms, blue coats, rifles, the United States cavalry. Elias's stomach sank. The column halted at the fence line. A dozen soldiers in sweat-stained hats, their horses lathered and panting. At the front rode a man with sharp shoulders and a mustache like a knife blade. Captain Jeremiah Harlan. Elias had met him once, years ago, when Harlan was still new to the frontier. He'd been young then, idealistic. Now, the years and the war had carved all softness out of him. "Turner," Harlan called out. You still breathing out here? Elias stood slowly, keeping his expression even. Most days, the captain dismounted, dusting off his gloves. His eyes flicked over the property, the cattle pen, the well, the porch. We're tracking a band of Apaches. 3 riders, maybe 4. Came through here recently. You seen anything? Elias felt the question like a knife point. He looked at the ground, then back at the captain. Apaches pass through these hills all the time. Haven't seen any this week. Harlan's gaze narrowed. You sure about that? I'm sure. The captain stared at him for a long moment, then stepped closer. Funny thing, Turner, they hit a supply wagon 3 days ago, over by the salt flats, killed the teamsters, took the rest of the food and horses. We tracked them here. Elias felt his pulse quicken. And what makes you think they came this way? Harlan pointed toward the water trough. Fresh tracks, Apache ponies, and see that bloodstain by your porch? You been doing some kind of charity work? Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The captain stepped up onto the porch, his boots heavy on the boards. Now, I know you're a good man, Turner. You fought with us at Mescalero, but harboring hostiles? That's a hanging offense these days. So, I'll ask again, where'd they go? Elias looked past him, toward the horizon. The desert stretched silent and endless. He thought of the old chief's eyes, of the boy's fever breaking by the fire, of the carved stone now glinting beside his coffee cup. They came here half dead, he said finally, voice steady. They asked for water. I gave it. Then they rode east. Harlan's expression hardened. You gave them water? That's right. The captain stepped back, jaw working. You think that's mercy, Turner? You think they'd do the same for you? Elias met his gaze. Doesn't matter. Harlan looked away, spitting into the dirt. You never did have much sense for war. You know how many good men we've buried because of them? How many families wiped out? Elias said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of sage. After a moment, Harlan barked orders to his men. Search the place. Check the barn, the well, everything. If they're hiding here, we'll find them. Elias stood still as soldiers spread out, kicking through the dust, opening barrels, tearing open the barn doors. He didn't stop them. He knew there was nothing to find. The Apaches were long gone, but it still burned to see his home turned upside down. When the men returned empty-handed, Harlan's scowl deepened. You're either a fool or a liar, Turner, but I'll give you one warning. If you ever feed or shelter them again, I'll see you hang from your own windmill. You understand me? Elias said quietly, I understand. The captain turned, swung into his saddle, and motioned his men forward. As they rode away, the dust they left behind hung over the ranch like a storm cloud. When they disappeared, Elias sat back down on the porch, the old boards creaking beneath him. He picked up the carved stone again, rolling it between his fingers. He wondered if mercy had a price, and if he'd just started paying it. That night, the wind came in from the east, carrying with it the scent of smoke. Elias stepped outside and saw the faint orange glow against the sky, far off. Near the edge of the mountains, a fire. The next morning, he found out why. A trader from the south stopped by with his wagon and told him. Army hit a village last night, said it was Apache, burned it to the ground. Whole families. Elias felt his chest go hollow. You know who was there? The trader shook his head. No survivors they could see. Elias walked out behind the barn, toward the canyon rim. The land stretched before him, silent and endless. He thought of the old man and his son, of the water he'd given them, of the promise they'd made. You give water, we remember. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, the carved stone heavy in his hand, listening to the wind move through the cracks in the walls. By morning, he had made up his mind. He saddled his horse and rode east, toward the smoke-stained sky. The land grew harsher with every mile. The rocks cut his horse's hooves, the sun baked his neck, but he pressed on until the hills opened into a small canyon. There, where the creek should have run, he found blackened earth, ash, charred wood, the smell of burnt leather and sorrow. He dismounted slowly, walking through the ruins. Everything was gone, the brush shelters, the fire pits, the drums, the tools. Only silence remained. Then he heard it, a soft cough. Elias turned sharply and saw movement under a collapsed beam. He rushed over and pulled it aside. Beneath it lay a small boy, Apache, maybe 8 years old, His arm burned, his eyes wide with terror. "It's all right," Elias whispered, kneeling. "You're safe now." The boy flinched, then stared at him, recognition flickering in his eyes. Around his neck hung a tiny copy of the same carved stone Elias carried. The boy's lips trembled. "You, give water." Elias felt his throat tighten. He nodded, "Yes." The boy pointed east. "Father, gone. Soldiers. Take him." Elias closed his eyes. The old chief, captured. He looked back toward the horizon, where the army had ridden days before. He knew what that meant. The prisoners would be taken to the fort, held, questioned, broken. He couldn't walk away this time. By dusk, Elias had reached Fort Bliss. The sentries stopped him at the gate, but he told them he had business with Captain Harlan. They let him through. He found the captain in his tent, standing over a map. Harlan looked up, annoyed. "What the hell are you doing here, Turner?" Elias dropped the carved stone on the table. It landed with a dull thud. "You burned their camp. You took their chief." Harlan frowned, glancing at the stone. "So what if we did? You know what these people are. Turner, killers, thieves. You give 'em mercy, they spit in your face." Elias stepped closer. That old man wasn't a killer. He was a father trying to keep his son alive. Harlan's expression didn't change. "That's how wars work. One father against another." "No," Elias said quietly. "That's how hate works." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence. Outside, the wind rattled the tent flaps. Finally, Harlan sighed. "You wanted to play saint, Turner? Fine, but don't expect the world to thank you for it. We'll hang the chief at dawn. Maybe it'll finally make the others surrender." Elias stared at him. "You hang him, and this land will bleed forever." The captain didn't answer. Elias left the tent without another word. But as he stepped into the night, he saw the boy again, the one he'd found in the ashes, crouched behind a wagon, eyes wide with fear and hope. Elias knelt. "You want your father back?" The boy nodded. Elias took a deep breath. "Then we do this together." The night was windless, the moon a thin blade in the sky. The fort was quiet, guards posted but weary. Elias moved like a shadow, the boy beside him. They slipped through the horse corral, past the barracks, toward the holding tent. Inside, behind a curtain of canvas, sat the old chief, wrists bound, eyes hollow but alive. When Elias cut the ropes, the old man looked up in disbelief. "Why?" he whispered. Elias answered softly, "Because dying in a cage ain't a way for any man to go." They slipped out under the stars, leading the horses by hand until they reached the open desert. By dawn, they were 20 miles away, riding toward the red hills where the world felt untouched again. At the ridge, the old chief stopped. He turned to Elias and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You give water again," he said. "You give freedom. We remember." He handed Elias a second carved stone, identical to the first. Then, without another word, he and the boy disappeared into the canyons. Elias watched them go, the rising sun painting the land gold. He knew he could never return home. The army would come for him. But as he rode west, he felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Mercy had a cost, but it also had a power. Weeks later, word spread like wildfire. The Apache raids ceased. Rumors drifted through the settlements, stories of a white rancher who had given water to his enemies and been spared in return. Some said he'd vanished into the desert. Others said the Apaches protected his name. But in every story, one thing remained the same. That one act of mercy had broken the cycle of blood. And when Captain Harlan was found a month later, ambushed in the canyon by men who could have killed him but didn't, they left behind only one thing, a small carved stone, lying in the sand beside his boots.